Mainstream military channels are selling you a dangerous, geometric fantasy about the upcoming invasion. They claim 5,000 US Marines, dropping from V-22. Ospreys will simply bypass Iranian defenses. But any seasoned combat veteran knows that pristine whiteboard plans rarely survive contact with grim reality. A $500 FPV drone swarm will instantly shatter those sterile animations you have clearly seen. What happens when a precision smart bomb hits a landing zone that is heavily saturated with raw yellow cake? Today, we are decoding the brutal, asymmetric reality of a Hormuz invasion that Pentagon strategists deeply fear. For 30 agonizing days, the United States Navy hammered 21 nautical miles of contested ocean water. 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles and 3 carrier strike groups rained absolute maritime hellfire. Despite thousands of combat sorties destroying 13,000 targets, the narrow strait remains firmly locked. So the Pentagon dispatched the USS Tripoli alongside the USS Boxer with 5,000 furious combat marines. The rugged geography of the Strait of Hormuz creates a perfect death trap for conventional maritime strike groups. We will skip the basic Wikipedia statistics about how F-35 Lightning aircraft and A-10 Warthogs normally operate. You already understand the devastating aerial firepower that a squadron of American fighter jets can easily deliver. The actual critical question is why the greatest naval armada since the Second World War failed to open the gap. To understand this epic strategic failure, we must deeply look beyond the standard surface warfare combat doctrines. Iran has engineered a terrifying defensive architecture that completely ignores our massive technological edge. The conventional amphibious invasion paradigm, which worked perfectly during the Gulf War, is now entirely obsolete. We are not analyzing a theoretical sandbox exercise today because the lives of thousands of young troops are at stake. The cunning enemy has spent 4 decades preparing for this exact moment, turning the islands into unsinkable fortresses. Welcome to the absolute bleeding edge of modern tactical warfare analysis, where we strip away all the comforting illusions. The fundamental problem is that the United States Navy was heavily optimized to fight a symmetrical surface war. Iran does not fight on the visible surface because their entire survival depends on deeply hidden defensive layers. Before the MEU can even insert, naval aviation must thoroughly degrade Iran's A2AD envelope covering the coastline. The Defense Intelligence Agency estimated that thousands of naval mines were quietly deployed before the war began. An advanced escort destroyer cannot effectively solve the terrifying problem of completely invisible underwater mines. Those deadly explosives sit perfectly still on the dark seabed, waiting patiently for a multi-billion-dollar carrier. But the insidious minefields only serve to violently channel approaching hostile ships into predefined killing zones. The heavily fortified islands acting as unsinkable aircraft carriers are bristling with anti-ship cruise missiles. Mobile coastal launchers remain hidden deep inside hardened mountain tunnels, waiting to strike unprepared warships. They can quickly drive out into the open, fire a devastating barrage, and rapidly retreat back into the dark earth. Pure, overwhelming firepower can absolutely destroy a static radar installation or a known missile silo on the ground. However, raw, explosive power from a safe distance simply cannot successfully physically seize and hold contested land. To actually open the strait, someone must bodily stand on the smoking ground and look directly down at the blue water. That daunting requirement is definitively not a standard destroyer mission, nor is it a glamorous carrier strike task. This brutal reality explains exactly why thousands of highly trained Marines have finally arrived in the theater of war. But landing troops on a hostile beach conventionally is absolute suicide when the enemy possesses functional air defense. The legendary MV-22B Osprey tiltrotor fundamentally alters this grim geometric calculation with unprecedented flight speed. By seamlessly transforming from a helicopter into an airplane, this machine ignores every traditional surface obstacle. It will simply fly at 15,000 feet, completely bypassing the dense minefields and the waiting coastal ambushes. The original script confidently claims that flying at 15,000 feet completely nullifies the Iranian defensive architecture. Let us be precisely clear about the terrifying physical realities of this highly specific and dangerous aerial insertion phase. The V-22 Ospreys offer incredible range, but their vulnerability during the final descent phase against hidden manpads is absolute. At high altitudes, the aircraft is undeniably safe, but Marines cannot physically occupy an island from the freezing stratosphere. Every single tiltrotor must eventually come down to the hostile ground, entering the most dangerous kinetic phase of the operation. During those final 60 to 90 seconds of terminal descent, the sophisticated Osprey becomes a massive, slow, and fragile target. The widely deployed Igla-S shoulder-fired missile systems are specifically calibrated to intercept targets in this exact height window. Mainstream analysts assume that attack helicopters and stealth fighters will easily suppress the landing zone before the troops arrive. However, clearing a zone is physically impossible when the island is infested with hidden manpads and loitering munitions. These deadly suicide drones do not rely on massive, easily detectable centralized radar stations to find and destroy their incoming targets. They operate autonomously in decentralized swarms, making traditional electronic warfare and radar suppression tactics completely useless. A 4-minute warning window sounds incredibly brief on paper, but it is an absolute eternity for an embedded suicide drone operator. The Marine commander is essentially sending his heavily loaded aircraft into a blind meat grinder without any guarantee of a safe extraction. The undeniable speed of the Osprey fundamentally changes the defensive calculus, but speed cannot magically bend the harsh laws of physics. When that reaction window inevitably collapses, the entire architectural plan of an amphibious aerial assault must be instantly rewritten. 24 heavily armed Marines are packed tightly into each aircraft, transforming every tiltrotor into a catastrophic casualty risk. 40 years of complex coastal defense was heavily built for a war that arrives by water, but the sky insertion brings its own unique hell. Do not forget that suppressing a localized beachhead does not magically neutralize the hundreds of decentralized firing teams hiding nearby. These entrenched Iranian forces have spent years mapping out every single viable landing zone on these barren and isolated rocky islands. They already know exactly where the Ospreys must touch down, because the treacherous mountainous terrain naturally dictates the flight path. Dropping highly trained Marines directly into pre-sighted kill zones is not a brilliant strategic move. It is a desperate and bloody gamble. The glorious initial insertion might actually succeed miraculously, but Day 2 operations introduce the true attrition sandbox. Securing a hostile beachhead is merely the bloody prologue to the absolute nightmare of subterranean tunnel clearance operations. The heavily fortified fortress islands of Abu Musa and Keshem are fundamentally designed to bleed an occupying force completely dry. Deep beneath the barren, rocky surface lies an incredibly complex labyrinth of hardened mountain facilities with multiple exit points. Mobile missile launchers and heavily armed insurgent cells can rapidly emerge from the dark earth, strike hard, and instantly vanish. To physically survive this relentless subterranean meat grinder, the Marines must rapidly deploy experimental microwave energy weapons. These highly advanced directed energy systems are the only viable defense against the continuous, swarming threat of suicide drones. Meanwhile, beneath the contested ocean surface, autonomous, unmanned mine-clearing submarines must methodically hunt the passive explosives. This terrifyingly slow robotic sweeping process must painfully occur while the island garrison remains under constant, heavy enemy fire. Sophisticated counter-battery radar systems are rapidly established on the high ground, desperately tracking the incoming artillery fire. However, the mathematical equation fundamentally proves that raw American firepower simply cannot decisively vaporize an entire mountain. The cunning Iranian commanders deliberately designed this exact brutal scenario to trap elite American troops in a bloody attrition sandbox. Every single heavily armored Marine stepping onto that cursed island instantly becomes another static and highly vulnerable organic target. Holding the vital ground that directly overlooks the narrow shipping lane is an entirely different task than simply bombing a radar site. The bitter reality of Day 2 is that the glorious amphibious assault rapidly devolves into a desperate and grinding struggle for survival. Isolated forces are totally cut off from standard naval resupply, while the entrenched enemy safely utilizes massive hidden stockpiles. This grim, asymmetric strategy strictly dictates the agonizing combat pace, effectively nullifying the massive American technological edge. Therefore, the highly anticipated operational victory instantly morphs into a devastating strategic trap, heavily soaking the sand with blood. The mainstream narrative completely ignores the brutal truth that defeating the enemy is not a simple firepower problem. Defeating the deeply entrenched enemy forces is fundamentally a massive logistical nightmare and a strict control problem. Maintaining a steady supply chain to an isolated rocky outpost is drastically harder than the initial combat insertion. Every single gallon of vital aviation fuel and heavy artillery shell must cross 21 miles of highly contested water. To an embedded enemy insurgent cell hiding nearby, a static marine base on Abu Musa is merely a target-rich environment. They do not ever need to successfully win a direct firefight against heavily armed combat veterans to achieve victory. The cunning defenders simply need to continuously bleed the fragile resupply lines dry over an extended period of time. In a harsh environment completely saturated with loitering munitions, force preservation becomes the absolute nightmare. The agonizing psychological pressure on the ground commander heavily compounds with every single incoming drone strike. Massive transport helicopters attempting to slowly deliver essential combat rations become incredibly vulnerable targets. Heavy lift cargo aircraft flying incredibly slowly over the contested strait will inevitably draw devastating enemy fire. The undeniable reality is that a glorious tactical landing means absolutely nothing without continuous and heavy resupply. The hostile local geography heavily dictates that securing a temporary foothold is astronomically easier than holding it. Every single wounded Marine needing immediate medical evacuation dramatically strains the heavily degraded logistical web. The entire American military doctrine is heavily predicated on an uninterrupted flow of overwhelming logistical support. When that critical supply umbilical cord is violently severed, the greatest fighting force rapidly becomes combat ineffective. The terrifying reality of this conflict is that conventional American military doctrine completely fails against decentralized warfare. Unlike a traditional standing army, the embedded IRGC fighters do not rely on massive centralized command structures to operate. They seamlessly utilize highly autonomous systems, transforming every barren rocky outcrop into a deadly and unpredictable trap. Cheap autonomous sea mines are continuously deployed by small civilian vessels, constantly threatening the narrow shipping lanes. These passive underwater explosives patiently wait for the inevitable logistical supply ships trying to reach the isolated Marines. Simultaneously, an endless swarm of incredibly cheap loitering munitions constantly circles above the highly contested airspace. These deadly suicide drones are specifically programmed to aggressively hunt any active radar signature or large troop gathering. To counter this relentless threat, the Marine artillery heavily relies on sophisticated and expensive counter-battery radar systems. However, activating these powerful tracking radars instantly turns the precious equipment into a glowing beacon for the drone swarm. The American forces are trapped in a deadly paradox, where using their best defensive technology actually invites immediate destruction. A $200,000 precision smart bomb is financially and practically useless against a massive swarm of toy quadcopters. This agonizing dynamic effectively neutralizes the overwhelming technological superiority that the Pentagon usually heavily relies upon. The harsh Iranian terrain actively collaborates with this brilliant asymmetric strategy, slowly bleeding the mighty superpower dry. The fundamental reality of the Hormuz crisis is that the narrow strait is never truly physically closed by steel barricades. It is practically and effectively closed to all global maritime traffic purely due to unacceptable financial risk. Global shipping conglomerates simply cannot afford the astronomical insurance premiums required to transit the dangerous water. The highly publicized arrival of 5,000 combat Marines does not magically lower these massive corporate insurance rates. Unless the persistent drone threat is completely neutralized at the source, commercial supertankers will absolutely remain paralyzed. The hostile forces have effectively established a deadly geopolitical toll booth between the contested islands of Larak and Keshem. Placing heavily armed troops on an isolated rock does not guarantee safe passage for civilian cargo vessels below them. A fifth of the vital global energy supply remains firmly locked behind this terrifying invisible wall of financial mathematics. Destroying a few coastal radar stations creates a comforting illusion of tactical control for the anxious mainstream television audience. True operational control requires permanently silencing every single hidden mobile launcher, threatening the vital commercial shipping lanes. The massive global economy continues to bleed billions of dollars daily, while the heavily entrenched opposing forces patiently wait. We must critically calculate the ultimate asymmetric wildcard, which is catastrophic radiological area denial. Using raw yellowcake to salt a targeted landing zone effectively ends the amphibious assault before boots hit the sand. The Pentagon meticulously plans for conventional explosions, but they dread the insidious spread of toxic nuclear dust. A simple dirty bomb detonated strategically turns a tactical objective into an uninhabitable radioactive wasteland. Marine standard biological and nuclear protective gear severely restricts their combat mobility in the sweltering heat. Attempting to clear a complex tunnel network while wearing suffocating gas masks is a literal nightmare for the troops. The cynical enemy fully understands that America cannot afford the political fallout of heavily irradiated casualties. This ultimate asymmetric strategy does not require sophisticated delivery systems or highly enriched weapons-grade fuel. They only need a single hidden detonator and a pile of crude radioactive material to completely deny the crucial terrain. The entire multi-billion-dollar invasion fleet becomes instantly useless when the physical ground itself is highly toxic. The geopolitical ramifications of a radioactive strait would send immediate shockwaves through the global energy markets. Corporate shipping insurers would instantly, permanently blacklist the entire region, causing a catastrophic economic crash. The Pentagon war games rarely publicly address the terrifying psychological impact of a heavily contaminated battlefield. An isolated Marine outpost is already a massive logistical nightmare without the added horror of invisible radiation. Decontaminating returning casualty evacuation helicopters would severely paralyze the medical facilities on the ships. Every piece of tactical gear that touches the radioactive sand must be carefully abandoned or painstakingly sanitized. The cunning Iranian forces do not need to physically annihilate the Marine battalion to achieve a massive strategic victory. They merely need to broadcast credible footage of American troops helplessly suffering from acute radiation sickness. Such horrific imagery would immediately destroy the fragile political will of the American public back on the home front. Domestic anti-war protests would violently erupt in every major city, while the military aggressively demands more resources. The regional allies who secretly supported the American invasion would instantly sever all their diplomatic and military ties. The entire coalition architecture would rapidly collapse under the unprecedented weight of a devastating radiological incident. This is exactly why the highly sanitized mainstream media continuously avoids discussing the true asymmetric capabilities. They prefer to confidently show you perfectly rendered animations of stealth fighters dropping incredibly precise smart bombs. But real modern warfare is exceptionally dirty, and it deliberately exploits every single conceivable humanitarian boundary. The dedicated IRGC commanders are deeply religious zealots who fully embrace martyrdom to protect their sovereign territory. They view the ultimate destruction of the crucial commercial waterway as a perfectly acceptable price for their total victory. The immense psychological burden resting upon the shoulders of the Marine Expeditionary Unit commander is truly crushing. He must constantly weigh the glorious promises of high-altitude ospreys against the gruesome reality of a radioactive trap. Every single tactical option presents a horrific compromise that heavily bleeds American resources and precious young lives. The sterile geometric fantasy of a clean surgical strike rapidly dissolves into the chaotic fog of unrestricted total warfare. The brutal truth is that taking the islands in the Strait of Hormuz might actually be the surprisingly easy part. Occupying a barren rock under a constant heavy rain of loitering munitions is undeniably the real grueling ground war. So I pass the heavy burden of operational command directly to you for a critical tactical assessment of this crisis. If you were the MEU commander, would you authorize the V-22 Osprey insertion despite the terrifying man-pad threats? Or would you securely remain offshore and rely entirely on an extended maritime naval and punishing aerial blockade? Let me know your exact tactical doctrine in the comments below, and I will pin the most realistic operational plan.